My name is Hilary Swank, and I am 67 years old. For 31 years, I gave my children everything I had, not metaphorically. Literally, I gave them my sleep, my savings, my Saturday mornings, my second helpings at dinner, my dreams of finishing my nursing degree, my knee cartilage from kneeling on cold bathroom tiles while they vomited through the night. I gave them the version of myself that was still soft and hopeful and believed that love was something you could pour out endlessly without ever needing it poured back. Then one Thursday afternoon in October, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and I realized I had not received a phone call from any of my 3 children in 11 days that was not about something they needed. Not one. I sat there counting backward in my head, going through each call like a woman auditing her own loneliness. The last call from my daughter Renee was about her car insurance. Before that, my son Derek called to ask if I still had Grandma Swank's china because he and his wife wanted it for their dining room. Before that, my youngest Tyler called to ask if I could watch his kids for a long weekend because he and his girlfriend wanted to go to Asheville. Not one of those calls began with, "How are you, Mom?" Not one ended with, "I love you." They ended when the need was satisfied, like a faucet being turned off. I want to tell you something before I get into this. If you are a mother reading this right now, if you are sitting somewhere quiet and trying to remember the last time one of your children called just to hear your voice, I need you to know that what I did next was not easy, and it was not clean, and I am still not entirely sure I handled all of it right. But I am sure that it was necessary. And I am sure that what came out the other side, broken and imperfect and real as it is worth every painful month of silence. But let me start at the beginning, because this story doesn't start in that kitchen. It starts much earlier. It starts in a small house in Roanoke, Virginia in 1984, with a 23-year-old woman who had just married a good man and was already pregnant with Renee, already shelving the nursing school application on the top shelf of the closet, already telling herself that this was fine, that family was the most important thing, that her time would come. It never came. My husband Gerald was a decent man. I want to say that clearly. He worked hard, he didn't drink, he was faithful. But Gerald had a particular blindness that I think a lot of men of his generation had, which was the belief that managing a home and raising 3 children while he went to work was not labor. It was not effort. It was simply what a wife did, the way a refrigerator simply kept things cold. You didn't thank a refrigerator. The refrigerator didn't need to be asked how it was doing. And so I mothered. God, how I mothered. I made Halloween costumes from scratch because the store-bought ones were flimsy. I drove 45 minutes each way to Renee's gymnastics, then back across town for Derek's little league, then home in time to put Tyler to bed. I went to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every graduation. I stayed up until 2 in the morning helping Derek with his college application essays, and then stayed up again 2 nights later doing the same for Tyler. When Renee's first marriage fell apart, I flew out to Seattle and stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping on her couch, helping her pack her ex-husband's things, taking her to therapy appointments, making sure she ate. I did not once think to calculate what this cost me. You don't calculate, you're their mother, that's not how it works. Gerald died in 2009. A heart attack, sudden, the kind where they call it massive because they want you to understand there was nothing to be done. He was 54, I was 48, and for the first time in my adult life I was alone. The children were adults by then. Renee was 25, Derek 23, Tyler 19. They rallied around me in those first weeks the way children do, crowding the house, eating up the casseroles the neighbors brought, sleeping in their old rooms. And for a brief, strange window I felt something I hadn't felt in years, which was that I was necessary to them not because of what I could do but because of who I was. Their mother, the person who held the center. That window closed faster than I want to admit. Within 6 months they were each back to their own lives. Within a year the calls started thinning. Within 2 years I noticed the pattern beginning, soft at first, easy to explain away. Renee called when she needed help navigating insurance paperwork because she knew I'd been on the phone with Gerald's estate. Derek called when he needed a recipe or when he and his wife were having a fight and he needed to vent. Tyler called when he needed money because Tyler was 21 and broke, which felt forgivable then. I excused it all. I told myself they were building their lives. I told myself this was normal. I told myself that my own mother had always said children leave, and that's the point, that's success, you raise them to not need you. I believed that story completely right up until I didn't. It was Renee who finally broke something open in me, though she'll never know exactly how or when. It was at Christmas 3 years ago. I had driven 4 hours to her house in Charlotte, brought gifts for her and her second husband Mark and both their kids, cooked Christmas dinner from scratch in her kitchen because her oven was better than mine, washed up afterward because Mark had had too much wine and Renee was tired. I sat in her guest room that night and opened my phone and realized she hadn't once asked me a single question about my life in the 4 days I'd been there. Not about my hip, which had been bothering me. Not about the women's group at church I'd joined and mentioned to her twice. Not about whether I was lonely. Nothing. I was there as a function. Christmas came with a mother. The mother came with cooking and presents and free childcare. That was the transaction. I drove home on December 26th, and I cried for the first 3 hours of that 4-hour drive. Not pretty crying. The ugly, heaving kind where you have to pull over on the highway because you can't see. I sat in a rest stop in the middle of South Carolina, and I asked myself out loud to no one whether this was just what life was now. Whether this was the reward for 31 years of pouring yourself out. Whether I had made some catastrophic error somewhere that I couldn't identify, or whether this was simply the math of motherhood. You give and give and give, and eventually they take you for granted so completely that taking you for granted becomes the whole nature of the relationship. I drove the rest of the way home in silence. I did not change anything that day. I want to be honest about that. I didn't suddenly set boundaries or have a revelation. I came home, I unpacked my bag, I called Renee to say I'd arrived safely, and she said, "Great, thanks for dinner, talk soon." I hung up and I sat with the particular feeling of being erased while still technically being present, still breathing, still answering. The next several months I paid very close attention in a way I hadn't before. I started noticing the shape of every interaction. Renee called in February to ask if I knew a good tax accountant. Derek called in March because he wanted to know if Grandpa's tools were still in my garage and could he have the drill press. Tyler called in April and April again, 3 times in 1 month, but every call was about money or the kids or whether I could come down to Greenville and help because he and his girlfriend were going through something. Not one of those calls in all those months contained the question, "Mom, how are you doing?" I started writing it down. Not obsessively, not in a ledger with columns, but in the back of a small notebook I kept by the kitchen table. Date, who called, what they needed, whether they asked about me. By July I had 6 months of data, and the column for whether they asked about me had 4 entries out of 37 calls. 4. I showed the notebook to my friend Claudette, who has been my closest friend since 1991, when our boys were in the same kindergarten class. Claudette looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at me and said, "Hillary, you have been invisible in your own family for years and you have been calling it love." That sentence went into me like a key turning in a lock. I want to be careful here, because what I decided to do next is the part people either understand immediately or don't understand at all. I decided to stop answering. Not forever. Not with a letter explaining myself or a family meeting or a heartfelt conversation about my needs, because I had tried softer versions of those things, and they had produced exactly nothing. I had mentioned to Renee twice, gently, that I wished she'd call just to talk. She'd said of course, absolutely, and then called 6 weeks later about her health insurance. I had told Derek once that I missed him, really missed him, not just his occasional visits, and he'd said he missed me too and meant it in the moment, and then I didn't hear from him for 5 weeks. Soft didn't work, so I went quiet. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't send a message saying I was taking space. I simply stopped picking up. When Renee called about her car insurance in October, I watched the phone ring. When Derek called about the China, I let it go to voicemail. When Tyler called about Asheville, I listened to his message and I put the phone down and I made myself dinner and I watched the news and I went to bed. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done, and also in some way I can't fully explain, it was the first autonomous act I had performed in decades. I was no longer a vending machine. I had stopped dispensing. The first week they called back. Renee called 3 times. Derek left 2 voicemails. Tyler texted twice with question marks. The second week Renee called once, frustrated. Derek sent a text asking if I was okay. Tyler didn't reach out at all. By the 3rd week it had gone nearly silent, and that silence told me everything I needed to know about the structure of what we had. Because if I had been truly loved, truly missed as a person rather than a function, the silence would have been unbearable to them within days. You don't go 3 weeks without reaching out to a person you love and wonder if they're okay. You do go 3 weeks without reaching out to a service you expect to just be there. I won't pretend those weeks were easy for me. I cried. I second-guessed myself at least once a day. I called Claudette more times than I can count. I sat in my house some evenings and the loneliness was so heavy I could feel the physical weight of it on my chest. I am 67 years old and I live alone in a house where the loudest sound most evenings is the refrigerator humming, and cutting myself off from even the thin thread of contact I'd had with my children felt, on the bad nights, like choosing to disappear entirely. But I kept going because Claudette kept reminding me of something important. The loneliness I was feeling now was not new, it was just newly visible. I had been lonely inside those phone calls for years. I had been lonely at Christmas in Renee's guest room. I had been lonely in the car crying for 3 hours. All I had done by going quiet was strip away the performance of connection and let myself see what had actually been true for a long time. About 6 weeks into my silence, something broke open. Tyler drove up from Greenville on a Tuesday, unannounced. I heard the car in the driveway and looked out the window and felt my heart do something complicated in my chest, because Tyler is my youngest and you love your youngest with a particular terror that never fully leaves you. He knocked. I opened the door. He looked bad, not physically but in the eyes, the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy and the carrying has started to show. He said, "Mom," just that, just my name in that way he hadn't said it since he was small. And then he said, I didn't know what else to do. I let him in, I made coffee, I sat across from him at the kitchen table and I waited. He talked for almost 2 hours, about his relationship falling apart, about money, about feeling like he was drowning and reaching for the rope and realizing the rope was me, always me, and that maybe he'd been doing that for years without thinking about what it cost the person holding the other end. He said, I called you 7 times in the last 6 weeks, Mom. I said, I know. He said, why didn't you pick up? And I said, quietly, not unkindly, because those 7 calls were the first time in months you thought about me at all, and you only thought about me because you needed something. The silence after that was the loudest thing I've ever heard. He didn't argue, that surprised me. I think a younger version of Tyler would have gotten defensive, would have started listing evidence for the defense. But he just sat there and I watched something shift in his face, watched the architecture of a narrative he'd been living inside start to come apart at the joints. He said, I didn't realize. I said, I know you didn't. That's actually the thing, Tyler, you didn't realize. It didn't occur to you to wonder. We talked for another hour. I told him about the notebook, not to wound him with it, but because I needed him to understand that what I was describing wasn't a feeling or an interpretation. It was a record. It was data. He looked at it for a long time and he didn't say anything, and I could see that he was doing what I had done driving home from Charlotte, which was trying to locate the moment where things had gone wrong and realizing it hadn't been one moment. It had been a slow accumulation of assumptions, that I would always be there, that I didn't have needs, that loving me required nothing more than occasionally calling when you needed something, because I had never required more than that. I made it too easy, I told him. For years, I made it so easy to take me for granted that you forgot I was a person. He started crying. Tyler cries the way he did as a boy, suddenly and completely without any warning or control. I handed him a paper towel because I was out of tissues and I let him cry, and I did not hug him immediately, which was the hardest discipline I have ever exercised, because every cell in my body wanted to pull him in and say it was fine. But it was not fine, and saying it was fine would have been the same old pattern wearing a new dress. When he was done, I said, I love you. I have always loved you, but love is not the same as service. I am your mother, not your vending machine, and I need you to know the difference. Renee came 3 weeks later. She did not come unannounced. She called from the road, and this time I answered because this call was different. She said, Mom, Tyler called me, can I come? I said yes. Renee and I have always had a more complicated relationship than Tyler and I, because Renee is firstborn and firstborns absorb a particular version of their parents' anxiety and ambition, and they carry it for life. She has always been simultaneously the child most like me and the one most determined to not need me, which is its own kind of defense mechanism. She came in and sat at the kitchen table in the same chair Tyler had sat in, and she was not crying and her jaw was set, and I knew she'd prepared what she was going to say. She said, I think I learned that you didn't need anything from watching Dad. That hit me somewhere I wasn't expecting to be hit. She said Dad never asked you how you were doing either. He just expected you to manage everything. And I think I watched that my whole life, and I thought that was what you wanted. To manage, to be useful. I didn't know that you were lonely. I had not cried in front of my children yet through any of this. I cried then, because she wasn't wrong. Gerald's blindness had become the template. My children had learned how to relate to me from watching a man who never thought to ask me what I needed either. And I had never questioned it loudly enough for anyone to hear. I had just kept pouring. We sat together for a long time that afternoon. We talked in a way we had not talked in years, maybe ever. She told me things about her marriage that she had never told me. I told her things about my loneliness in the years since Gerald died that I had never told anyone but Claudette. It was not a Hallmark movie conversation. There were long silences and a few moments that felt too raw to look at directly. But it was real. It was the realest conversation I can ever remember having with my daughter. Derek was harder. Derek processes things slowly, and he processes them internally, and he does not like to be told he has been wrong because he spent most of his childhood trying to be right. He came in December, nearly 2 months after Tyler, a month after Renee. He sat at that same table and he said, "I've been thinking about the notebook." Just that. And then he said, "I called you 37 times in 6 months and I only asked about you 4 times. I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "I don't know who I thought you were." It was the most honest thing I think Derek has ever said to me. I'm not going to tell you that everything was fixed after those 3 conversations. That would be a lie, and this is not a story that wants to be a lie. The months since have been imperfect and halting and occasionally backsliding in ways that require me to speak up in the moment instead of letting it accumulate again. Renee called in January about her taxes and caught herself mid-sentence and said, "I'm also calling because I miss you." I wanted to say that first. It was awkward and a little staged and completely genuine. Derek texts more now, not about anything in particular, just sending me pictures of things he thinks I'll like, a bird on his feeder, a good sunset. Tyler calls on Sunday evenings mostly, and sometimes the call is about something he needs and sometimes it isn't, and the proportion has shifted enough that I can feel it. We had Easter dinner here, all 3 of them with partners and grandchildren, around my dining room table with Gerald's mother's china that Derek had wanted to take. He never took it. I brought it out instead. There were 9 of us and the meal was chaotic, and one of Tyler's kids knocked over a glass of juice and Renee's husband Mark said something mildly offensive about someone's political opinions, and there was a tense 20 minutes before it smoothed over. My hip hurt from standing in the kitchen all morning. It was not a perfect afternoon. But Renee asked me twice how I was feeling. Derek did the dishes without being asked. Tyler pulled me aside before they left and hugged me for a long time and said, quietly against the side of my head, "Thank you for not just disappearing." I said, "I'm still here." I meant it in every way it could be meant. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 48 or at 55 or even at 63. Being a mother does not mean you are a function. Being a parent does not mean you dissolve. The love you have for your children is real and enormous, and I would not trade 1 sleepless night of it, not 1 gymnastics carpool, not 1 hour of crying in a rest stop in South Carolina. But love is not a transaction where one party gives everything and the other party takes everything, and the arrangement is called family. That's not family, that's labor without a contract. I had spent 31 years making myself so easy to take for granted that I essentially trained my children to take me for granted. I removed every obstacle to my own invisibility. I never said, "See me." I never said, "I'm not only here when you need something." I only said, "I'm here," and they heard that as I will always be available. And eventually, "I am available" became "I am here for whatever you need," and then it became "I have no needs of my own," and then it became "I am not really a person at all, just a resource with a phone number." The silence I chose was not abandonment. I want to be clear about that. It was the first time in 31 years that I had communicated to my children that my presence was not guaranteed, that I was not furniture, that there was a person on the other side of the line who needed something back. Something as simple as, "How are you, Mom?" before we get to the car insurance, before the china, before the Asheville trip. I'm not perfectly healed. Some mornings I sit with my cold tea and I still feel the particular loneliness of a woman who poured herself out for decades and is now slowly, painstakingly learning to be refilled. I still sometimes catch myself about to just absorb something, just take on someone's problem quietly without numbing my own need, and I have to stop and choose differently. It is a muscle I am building late. It is hard. But I am building it. My name is Hilary Swank, and I am 67 years old, and I am finally, fully, undeniably a person. If you are a mother in this story right now, somewhere in its middle chapters, maybe still driving home crying, maybe still letting the calls pile up without saying anything, I want to give you the thing it took me until 67 to understand. The love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is a habit. And habits, even old ones, can be broken. Not without pain, not without risk, not without sitting in your kitchen alone wondering if you've broken everything, but they can be broken. Stop waiting for your children to see you. See yourself first. Take up space. Require to be asked about. Answer the phone when they call to hear your voice, and gently, firmly, lovingly stop answering when they call only to be serviced. You are not a vending machine. You never were. You just forgot to tell them so. 9 plates at Easter was a start. It's still a start. And some mornings that is enough.